Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 832 for August 16th, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
Whiskey makers are pretty unique. We kind of live in the past because these are the whiskies that have been made for us. We live in the present, which is now, and let's enjoy where we are now and make the most of what we got. But also we've got this huge responsibility to think of the future, to make sure that the whiskies we make today, the decisions that we're making today, are the right ones for the future as well. So we do live in a world of past, the present and the future all the time together.
Johnnie Walker is celebrating its 200th anniversary this year, and Jim Beveridge is only the 6th master blender in the brand's history. It's a lineage that goes back all the way to John Walker himself. Jim and his team have created 4 new whiskeys for the 200th anniversary, and we'll catch up with Jim on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and a look at the impact of losing this year's Kentucky Bourbon Festival.
We even have a motor coach that was already booked for that date, so we were expecting even our October dates to be a good weekend for us. Now I'm just not sure what to expect at all.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. There's good news and bad news on the whiskey tariffs front. First, the good news. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer did not recommend an increase in the 25% import tariff on single malt whiskies from Scotland and Northern Ireland this past week, nor did he recommend expanding the tariff to other whiskies from Europe. The bad news? The current tariff will remain in place until at least after the November election. There had been a real concern that Lighthizer was prepared to expand the tariffs in his agency's second review since those tariffs were imposed last October. Since then, single malt imports from Scotland and Northern Ireland have fallen off by nearly a third, with estimates of the impact reaching more than $300 million. In his announcement that the tariffs would remain in place, Lighthizer said the European Union and its members have still not taken steps to come into compliance with World Trade Organization rules on subsidies for Airbus. That's even after Airbus restructured its subsidy packages last month in a move it says complies with the WTO standards. I talked with Distilled Spirits Council CEO Chris Swanger shortly after the decision was announced.
We appreciate the USTR has decided not to further escalate the tariffs on distilled spirits products. We certainly hope that this decision helps set the stage for the U.S. and the EU to quickly find a path to resolve these long-standing trade disputes, not even really related to our industry. So the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States is very, very committed to working with both USTR and the EU to try to get these matters resolved going forward. The U.S. hospitality industry, has been facing its greatest challenges in decades with the impact that COVID-19 has created for restaurants and bars on both sides of the Atlantic. We hope both governments can find a path to reduce the financial burden on the hospitality industry in the U.S. and in Europe as well. And we encourage both governments to get to the negotiating table.
When is the next review scheduled for? I would assume after the election now, you think? They're generally doing these about every 3 to 4 months, right?
That's correct, Mark. So the EU could review sometime over the next couple of months. Maybe it could be after Election Day on November 3rd, but that would be the next step. And certainly the arbitration on the Boeing and Airbus case and the WTO ruling on any kind of penalties related to Boeing. But as you know, earlier this summer, USTR announced that USTR believes the U.S. has addressed the subsidy issues with Boeing. So I think the next thing to possibly watch is when the WTO will finalize its decision on the Boeing subsidy issue. And, of course, we'll be holding our breath and strongly advocating that the U.S. and the EU get to the negotiating table and resolve the issues not only over the Section 232 steel and aluminum issue that has greatly impacted American whiskey exports from the U.S. to the EU have declined by 33%. And then, of course, we want the issues resolved over the Boeing and Airbus case as well.
Well, you mentioned the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. Last week, the administration announced that it was reimposing tariffs on aluminum and steel from Canada. The last time they did that, we got a 10% tariff on American whiskey imports into Canada. You afraid that could happen again this time around?
Great question, Mark. You're good. You've got your finger on the pulse on these issues. And when that announcement came out, I'd have to say I was holding my breath a little bit and getting anxious. But we understand any type of response Canada may have, it'll be directly related to like-minded products. So I think based on what we know today, there should be no risk of Canadian tariffs being imposed on American whiskey products or American distilled spirits products as a result of last week's announcement.
Well, it sounds like the industry dodged a bullet with this one.
Maybe, but we're taking it in the head with a couple of bullets on a 25% tariff, certainly from the EU on American whiskey, and it's taking it hard on the tariffs imposed on cordials, liqueurs, single malt Scotch, and Irish whiskey from Northern Ireland. So we're going to keep working, really encouraging both the U.S. and the EU to get to the negotiating table, stay at the negotiating table, and resolve these issues.
Scotch Whisky Association executives called on the UK government to speed up trade talks with the U.S. before they're delayed until after the November election. They also called the current £500,000 of export promotion funding woefully inadequate to mitigate the damage to Scotland's economy from the tariffs. Meanwhile, the decision announced last week to turn this October's Kentucky Bourbon Festival into a virtual event because of the COVID-19 pandemic is going to have a significant impact on the local economy in Bardstown, Kentucky. Bourbon Festival Week is traditionally one of the biggest weekends of the year in Bardstown, with thousands of people coming in from as far away as Australia. Ted Buranoff is the general manager of the Hampton Inn in Bardstown and has watched his hotel fill up every September for years. The Hampton has remained open throughout the pandemic, but with occupancy rates far below normal. He told me this week that Bourbon Festival Week usually generates around $50,000 in revenue for the Hampton.
One of our biggest weekends of the year is the week of Bourbon Festival, right up there with the Kentucky Derby for us in terms of special events and the impact that has on our hotel. It's been devastating. The initial move was a bad sign when they announced that. We've always had that date in September. When they pushed it back, that was the first sign that things may be falling apart a little bit. And then last week they announced the whole thing would be a virtual festival. So in terms of business, we've had a tremendous drop of expected revenues or traditional revenues that we have on Bourbon Festival to just being a sort of a normal weekend in these slower COVID times that we're in.
You would have had the entire place rented out for Bourbon Festival Week every year, as it has been for years.
Has been for years. We work closely with some of the major distilleries and the Bourbon Festival office. So really year to year, we're 90% committed from year to year, just with those offices. So they had agreed to hold that same number of rooms for the October dates. We even have a motor coach that was already booked for that date. So we were expecting even our October dates to be a good weekend for us. Now I'm just not sure what to expect at all.
How has it been this year, losing the Bourbon Trail for the most part of the year and not having people coming through Bardstown as much?
You would be surprised how many people continue to come to Bardstown to enjoy the attractions on the Bourbon Trail all through the pandemic. I was really quite surprised. I would ask people where they were from. Seemed to be a lot of people from Pennsylvania and Ohio, West Virginia, just looking, the typical things you want to see in Bardstown. So I was surprised that we still had that. The numbers were drastically off, but it never fell off completely.
Even though the distilleries were closed for several months.
I think there was a gap, when distilleries closed, there wasn't, you couldn't actually go in, but I'm telling you, it didn't stop some people from coming in. And then once the distilleries opened their tasting rooms and tours, we saw an increase from that too. Nothing like last year, though.
What is the impact going to be on Bardstown in general? Because you've been around for a long time around this town. What's the impact going to be from losing the festival this year?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I think that we're going to have a festival next year. And I think next year will be a return to, what we like to expect from our tourist industry and our travel segment here in Bardstown. I don't know if that's going to happen, but if we are able to get past the pandemic and we resume the Bourbon Festival, I think it will be just as strong as it ever was, maybe even more so.
But you've got a bunch of businesses in this town that may not be around next year. If some of the restaurants, some of the bars, some of the gift shops may not be able to survive to next year because of the lost business this year, right?
That's a very true aspect that I hadn't thought about, but I don't know. Hopefully, when restaurants close and they can't make it through the pandemic, once we're on the other side of it, maybe someone will fill those opportunities there.
On top of that, the Hampton Inn has new competition. Since last year's Bourbon Festival, a Holiday Inn Express and a Fairfield Inn have opened nearby. That's helping solve what has been seen for years as a shortage of hotel rooms in Bardstown, and Burnoff welcomes the competition. We do have new whiskeys to mention this week. Taiwan's King Car Distillery is coming out with its first Kavalan peated whiskey this October. It's also the first Kavalan release in several years to use the STR, shaving, toasting, and recharring process that was created for Kavalan by the late Jim Swan. It'll be available at first exclusively in Taiwan as part of a Christmas 4-bottle set. There's no word on pricing. Westland Distillery in Seattle is launching a new range of American single malts. The Outpost range will debut in October with the release of this year's Garyana Edition 5. This one will have 36% of its whiskey matured in Gary oak casks from the Pacific Northwest. Colera will follow next spring. It gets its name from the Latin verb for to cultivate. It's the first Westland release created in conjunction with the Washington State University Bread Lab, which has been working with local farmers to develop new varieties of barley outside of the commodity grain system. We covered the Bread Lab's work this past February in episode 807 of WhiskyCast. And we now know when Westland will release its first peated whiskey that uses peat from its bog on Washington's Olympic Peninsula. That whiskey will be called Solum, once again coming from Latin, this time for soil. It'll be released in 2023. This year's Garyana will be bottled at 50% ABV and carry a recommended retail price of around $150 a bottle. Maker's Mark is releasing its second annual bottling in its wood finishing series. This year's edition uses 2 different stave profiles specially created by Independent Stave Company to enhance the vanilla and caramel notes in the whiskey. It'll be bottled at a cask strength 55.4% ABV and will be on sale in the U.S. for a limited time this fall. There's no word on pricing. And Sagamore Spirit in Baltimore has been experimenting with different types of wood as well. Its new Distillers Select Manhattan finish is not, as you might think from the name, finished in barrels that had been filled with Manhattans. Instead, it's created to be used specifically to make Manhattans, with rye whiskey finished in a combination of barrels that previously held cherry brandy, bitters, and vermouth. It'll be available throughout the U.S. starting next month for around $70 a bottle. On the Scotch whiskey front, Douglas Lang & Company is releasing its latest edition of the Epicurean, its blended malt featuring whiskies from the Lowlands. This one is a single cask bottling finished in Reeves salt wine casks from France, and there are only 2 casks available. It's the third in the Epicurean's Wood series of releases. It'll be available at whiskey shops for around £60 a bottle. We now have more details on Waterford Distillery's debut releases that will arrive in the U.S. starting in October. 4 different expressions will be crossing the Atlantic. Gaia Organic uses organically grown barley from more than one farm in Ireland, while the Rathclaw, Dunmore, and Dunbell releases are all single-farm origin whiskies. Those 3 will carry a recommended retail price of $95 a bottle each, while the Gaia Organic will have a recommended price of $110 a bottle. I received pre-release samples this weekend, and I'll have my tasting notes for them soon. Finally, we have some sad news to report. We lost another one of American whiskey's unsung heroes this week. Dick Stoll started distilling years ago at what was then the Penco Distillery in Schaefferstown, Pennsylvania, working for Edward Beam. Yes, the Beam family's influence extends far beyond Kentucky. Dick eventually became the master distiller at what was also known as Bomberger's Distillery and Michter's Distillery at various times, until it went out of business in 1989. In fact, Dick Stoll was assigned by the bankers to close the place down and do the final inventory. His claim to fame: he was the distiller who made the legendary A.H. Hirsch Reserve 16-year-old bourbon. It was the subject of Chuck Cowdery's book, The Best Bourbon You'll Never Taste. Last year, I sat down with Dick Stoll at the American Whiskey Convention in Philadelphia and asked him just what made that bourbon so special.
I always give the credit to Mr. Hirsch himself because he kept it in a barrel so long. He had us make 400 barrel for him, and we put it in one of our warehouses, Warehouse B, in the one spot, and it stayed there until it left to go down to Kentucky, which was like 16 years later. And if we wouldn't have closed, his whiskey would probably be there yet. He didn't really care about it. He was friends with some of the owners from Philadelphia, and he had them make some whiskey for him to help him out. He didn't really want it, but it ended up one of being the better whiskeys that ever were on. So they tell me, anyhow.
Dick Stoll came out of retirement a few years ago to become a partner in the Stoll and Wolf Distillery in Lidditz, Pennsylvania. His colleagues posted this tribute on the distillery's Facebook page this weekend. The last thing Dick would want is for anyone to shed a tear, but rather to raise a glass to a life well lived. May we all be so lucky. The other thing Dick would want, I can hear him now and see his wry smile, get the hell back to work. And that is how Dick Stoll wanted to be remembered.
I couldn't tell you. I did my job. I thought I made a good product, but people tell me I did. Of course, the A.H. Hirsch made me more than anything. But outside of that, I went to work every day and did my job.
Dick Stoll was 86 years old. Our condolences go out to his wife Elaine, his business partners Eric Wolf and Aviana Ponzi, and all of his many friends in the world of whiskey. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. Time now for the calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. We're seeing a handful of in-person events being added in places where health restrictions and social distancing allow for it. New York City's Fine and Rare Whiskey Bar has an outdoor whiskey tasting set for this Tuesday night, while Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville has its Way Back Wednesday tasting this week and next Wednesday night to wind up the month. The Bavarian Inn restaurant in Frankenmuth, Michigan has a Maker's Mark bourbon dinner Friday night the 21st. Also on Friday, Bonham's will hold its next whiskey auction in Hong Kong. Waterford Distillery in Waterford, Ireland has its first ever open day coming up on September 5th. Whiskey and Barrel Night is still on for now on September 16th in Paramus, New Jersey, and tickets are also still on sale for the Whiskey Guild's New York City Whiskey Cruise the next night on the 17th. And as of now, the Liverpool Whiskey Festival is still scheduled for September 19th, and the Stockholm Beer and Whiskey Festival is still on the calendar for the weekends of September 24th through the 26th and October 1st through the 3rd. Of course, all of these events are subject to change on short notice depending on local public health restrictions, so make sure you check with event organizers before you make any travel plans. We are updating the calendar of events at the WhiskyCast website with new events and changes to previously scheduled ones as details become available. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of Virginia's most awarded spirits. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the Where to Buy page at CatoctinCreekDistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. 200 years ago, John Walker opened his small grocery store in Scotland. And like many of his counterparts, he started blending teas and eventually whiskies. His descendants eventually got out of the grocery business, but the whiskey, well, they kept that part and built Johnnie Walker into one of the world's most well-known whiskey brands. Jim Beveridge has only been part of that history for the last 4 decades or so, but he is only the 6th person to hold the title of Master Blender for Johnnie Walker. He's also responsible for leading the blending team that created 4 new whiskeys to mark the 200th anniversary. We reported on those whiskeys earlier this month in the news, and I was able to catch up with Jim on an occasionally noisy Zoom call this week. Jim, first of all, let's talk about what you've been doing since COVID hit in the pandemic. How have you and your blending team been keeping busy with not being able to be in the lab all the time together?
Well, actually, the team has still been working during the period. They've been able to go into the blending rooms, and although they have to maintain social distancing, so their way of working's changed a lot. But basically, they've still been able to work in the blending rooms, albeit under different conditions. I'm slightly different, though, because being over 60, I was considered to be in the high risk category, so I was told to work from home. So to do that, the folks in the blending room, they sent me samples, and I set up my own blending room at home. So that's how it worked. So yeah, we've managed to continue more or less normally, although I've had to work from home instead, setting up my own blending room. But things have relaxed a bit, and I'm now able to go back in, so it's almost back to normal.
How was it having your blending lab at home? How much room did it take up, for instance?
Well, it took up quite a lot of room, and it's funny. It's something you take for granted when you go into your own working space. So I had to create that at home, and tried several setups, but I got the ideal formula, and it works quite well. One thing is that I do get a lot of time and peace at home, so it's more contemplative, and so I've kind of created a working space which I actually really enjoy.
One of the symptoms of COVID-19 that scares me to death is this loss of smell and taste. I've got to imagine that would be the one that would scare you as a blender, or any blender or taster. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it scares everyone, I'm sure. But certainly if that were to happen, that would be extremely difficult. Because, personally, I think most people, we live in a world where our sense of smell and taste are so important. And to lose that dimension, must be something that takes a bit of getting used to. So yes, I fully sympathise with all those who've experienced those symptoms. I think particularly in our world of blending, when we depend so much on flavours, that would have a huge effect on the way we think and work.
I know a lot of folks have found themselves working from home and wind up spending actually more time working because it's just easier to stay at home and just keep pounding away at things. Was that the case for you, or did you have to set specific hours for yourself?
Well, yes, it rings a bell. I kind of fell into the trap of just continuing working, and I've certainly found that I really have to set boundaries and stop. It just, as I used to do, I was thinking, I would leave at a certain time and I would travel home to, that in the car, and it would be designed around avoiding heavy traffic and stuff like that. So there was a fixed time scale for my job, and I really got to impose that similar discipline. Otherwise, working from home, you never really get a break, and I think it's important to have a break.
I know that feeling. So
yeah.
How did this affect the creation of these anniversary whiskeys for Johnnie Walker? Were these done before the pandemic or worked on during the pandemic? Did this process affect that at all?
Well, the blends themselves had been created before the pandemic started, but they had to be assembled and bottled during the lockdown period. So that presented challenges to my colleagues who were actually, carrying out that part of the work. But certainly, the blend had been thoroughly worked out beforehand. It was just the actual bottling and packaging of it had to be done under slightly different conditions.
I'm curious, when you're doing, say, the Bicentenary blend, the John Walker and Sons edition that has all these distilleries that are closed, places like Port Helen for now, Cambus, Pittyvake, and others. When you're blending, you've got a finite amount of whiskey to work with from these places. It's probably a little easier, I would imagine, when you're building a blend from modern distilleries, because if you need some more, you can always get some more. But when you're building a blend from closed distilleries, you've only got so much liquid to work with before you start tapping into the stockpile, right?
It is. It's a huge responsibility because the stocks they're finite. They will not be replaced, and that's the whole point about these ghost distilleries. So it's a great responsibility, and we have to think about how we use them carefully. So in choosing them for these blends, the decision was made that these finite stocks will be dedicated to these Johnnie Walker blends. And it was a great delight to work with these whiskies and create blends around them. But yes, it's a huge responsibility. They're there to be enjoyed, certainly. It's just what's the best way to use them, and it's great that we're able to use them in this way in these blends.
What does it mean to you to be creating these 200th anniversary blends for one of the iconic whiskey brands of the world?
Well, it certainly was a challenge, and also again a sense of responsibility. There is this. There's these 200 years, and you think about all the different things that have happened in 200 years and all the achievements that have been made by Johnnie Walker in that time. And in a way, in creating these blends, we were trying to, in a way, summarise that in a way that our consumers can enjoy the story, enjoy the heritage, and also enjoy the blends as well. and do it in a manner in which the traditions of Johnnie Walker say we should do. So thinking very much about who's going to consume the blends and the kind of whiskies that they like. And so it's with that knowledge trying to then create something that captures the history of the 200 years.
And you want people to drink these. You don't want them just to sit on a shelf and collect dust, right?
Absolutely. They're for enjoying, just like Johnnie Walker's done for the 200 years. These whiskies are for enjoying, definitely.
The Yost and Rare releases, did that influence what you did with the 200th anniversary editions?
Well, yes. I mean, Ghost and Rare has been very successful, and the flavour styles that we use for Ghost and Rare, we've learned a lot from that. So when we came to these 200th anniversaries, we certainly used that knowledge. In general, the 200th anniversaries have been very much influenced by the concept of the 200th anniversary, and that, in a way, has determined which distilleries and which styles were going to be used for these 200th anniversary editions. So that very much drove the kind of flavours that we wanted to create for the 200th anniversary liquids. And when we pass through this 200th edition and move on to the next phase of innovations, we've certainly taken a lot of the learnings from the Ghost and Rare series and from this 200th anniversary and combine those into the next expressions that we'll work on.
I want to switch over to the Blue Label Legendary 8. You've got 8 distilleries to work with in this one, all some of the legendary distilleries of Scottish whiskey. When you're building a blend and you've got only 8 distilleries to work with, how hard is that to create a good blend, knowing that, for instance, if there's one distillery that just doesn't quite fit or whatever, you can't just swap it out for another one. You've got these 8 to work with.
Yes, and they are amazing whiskies. There's quite a lineup: Oban, Blair Athol, Lagavulin, Teenach, Brora, Cambus, Portland, Dask, Carsbridge. I mean, they're all amazing whiskies to work with. So yes, the challenge is how to assemble these superstars to create a blend that in which they all work together. And it is only 8. And interestingly, we're quite open about which 8 are being used. So it's another part of the puzzle that needs to be put together. As single malts and grains, they are each in their own right quite individual. And so it's getting them to work together is certainly a challenge. But it's something that we really enjoy doing. We've got sort of sweet vanilla flavours, and then layered on top of that are some fresh flavours and sort of complex fruity flavours. That's the way these whiskies slowly combine together to create the blend that we've made.
Are there distilleries that work and play together better with others than other distilleries?
Well, certainly some distilleries are very individualistic, and they'll play different roles in the blend. So quite often the blend will be constructed around the sort of major players, and then the ones that are more individualistic are in there with a very precise role. Often it's to bridge the flavours together, to connect them, and often it's also to bring in a unique and individual flavour which only that distillery can produce. So they play important roles, but it's the other whiskies that create the sort of matrix in which those individuals will then be allowed to combine to create the overall flavour.
Now, you actually had to do this pretty much almost twice, because we had the Legendary 8 Blue Label, but you also had the John Walker and Sons Celebratory Blend, which had to use distilleries from the 1860s. And that's another finite amount of players you can work with as well, right?
Well, yeah, the Celebratory Blend, we were working with, if you like, the records from the 1860s to give us a sense of the flavour style. And then we chose whiskies which were in existence at that time. So that, again, is a handful of distilleries. So in a way, that was a challenge there. In a way, we were trying to create a style which we believed would be similar to the styles that would be made around that time, but at the same time, a blend which we knew our consumers today would enjoy. So that, again, is making that connection. We had great fun with this blend. And one of the interesting things is that the whiskies around that time, for Johnnie Walker anyway, they were sold at quite a high strength. In our terms, 51%. So they were in those days, that was the standard serve of these whiskies. So we wanted to go back to that strength and create a blend which would, work well with the whiskies that were in existence at that time, with a view to how our consumers today enjoy Johnnie Walker. And the celebratory blend is very much for lovers of Johnnie Walker, flavour styles that they'll recognise and want to enjoy. And so combining all these together was what sat behind this blend. It was great fun doing it.
I can imagine, because just coming up with all the combinations, did you come up with combinations that you didn't use for these four that might find their way into a future release at some point? Because I imagine you come down to a few candidates for the final selection.
Yeah, there's all sorts of ways of doing it. It's blending is, there are so many possible combinations, and you kind of go on a journey which is, you think is predictable, but then suddenly you'll come to a point when you connect two together and it gives you something quite different. So that's the way the blends are created. And in doing so, we make notes. And you're right, some of those combinations we'll keep for later. They'll be kept. That record of how the blend was created has been kept, and we can use that knowledge for later expressions. Specifically for this blend, though, we wanted one that, in a way, captured the 200 years, was of the style that someone around the turn of the 18th, 20th century would enjoy. The style, the strength was about similar strength to those days, but at the same time being a blend which today's consumers of Johnnie Walker would still enjoy.
On that note, I don't think I've ever asked you this one. Do you have your own bespoke blend that you have at home, Jim's blend?
All of the blends I have at home have been bottled, so they have been sold and in the market. And what I do though is, of the various blends that we've made, I have a few which I've kept because in some way they're sort of definite signposts along the way of working as a blender with Johnnie Walker. So yeah, as I say, I do have blends. They've all been produced for, to be sold in the market, but some of them are special to me because they mark points in time of the journey through my career, and that's the reason why I have them.
You don't have, though, your own everyday dram that you have put together that we'll never see in the public, that we'll never get to try, that you have the only recipe for it?
Well, it's a really interesting thought. It had never really crossed my mind to do that. But you certainly set the idea in train. The answer is no. One of the this is a technical thing, but one of the things that would block that idea would be our customs and excise regulations, because essentially, when we consume our whiskies, we have to pay tax and all those things, and so that has to be above the board, and that's principally why all the bottles I have at home will have been official products that have gone through all that official procedure. But that's an interesting thought. We should try and see if we can't find. It's another way of. I'll turn the question around a bit, because I think if there was such a blend that I really enjoyed, if there was such a thing, then I would want to share it, and it would almost certainly be bottled in some way.
Fair enough. Let's talk about the 200th anniversary. What else is happening to celebrate the anniversary? And I know this is not in your purview, but we found out last week that the experience in Edinburgh will be delayed until sometime next year because of the pandemic. I know there were hopes to have that open in time for the anniversary, but what else are we going to see around the 200th anniversary?
Well, there had been quite a few things that had been lined up. We'd intended sort of global parties, some of the most important cities in our history, mixing with our bartenders at the World Class in Sydney in 2020. That was to be a big event. And there was to be new whisky experiences being opened in Scotland. So there was a lot that had been planned for 2020, and I was really looking forward to it. However, as we all know, that had to change, and our top priority has been, the health and safety of our teams and supporting industry, through this kind of unprecedented time. But when the time feels right, we'll look forward again to working with our local partners in the world and kickstart, the celebratory plans once again. raise a glass to everyone's future together. So in a way, it's taken 200 years to be where we've got to. No, we can hold it back for a bit yet, and let's make the most of it when the right time comes.
I think that's the key to Scotch whiskey, is being patient, waiting for the right time.
Yes, it's all about being at the right time. Definitely, yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
One final question. I don't think I've ever asked you this one either. With all the chances to taste as many of the rare old whiskeys in the archives that you've had the chance to taste, if we give you a time machine and you can go back in time and stop any of the distilleries that are closed now from being shut down, and go back and change somebody's mind and say, no, you don't want to do this, which one do you go back and save?
That's an amazing question. In a way, the question, there's lots of thoughts that question's inspired. In a way, with the reopening of Port Ellen and Brora, in a way that begins to answer the question, because I think quite often we look at things we look at decisions in hindsight, and they might have been the right decision at the time, but in hindsight we have a different perspective, and in a way it's that hindsight that has led us to, and the experience since the closure of those two distilleries, that the hindsight tells us, well, you know what, let's reopen those distilleries and start that story again. So I think that would be a good example. It's hard to say what would I like to be, if you could go back to the past and start again. I'm not sure if I'd have the ability. As I say, hindsight's always 20/20. When you look back and you think, well, if only. But at the time, it seemed the right thing. And so I'm very much in a place that says, let's think about what we have now and make the blends that we know our consumers will enjoy today. And that's very much the world I live in. Is the world of today. Whiskey makers are pretty unique. We kind of live in the past because these are the whiskies that have been made for us. We live in the present, which is now, and let's enjoy where we are now and make the most of what we got. But also we've got this huge responsibility to think of the future, to make sure that the whiskies we make today, the decisions that we're making today, are the right ones for the future as well. So we do live in a world of the past, the present, and the future all the time together.
By the way, the 200th anniversary Johnnie Walker Blue Label and John Walker & Sons whiskeys will be available this autumn. And thanks to Jim Beveridge for spending some time with us this week on WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret, hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies. Comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Earlier this month, we introduced Dewar's as our newest presenting sponsor of WhiskyCast, and I'm noting that here by way of full disclosure. I had the chance to taste their newest release, Dewar's Illegal Smooth, which is finished in mezcal casks and bottled at 40% ABV. The nose has notes of agave, lemon, lime, honey, vanilla, and just a hint of fresh-cut grass. The taste is tart and spicy, with lemon, lime, white pepper, chili powder, and touches of vanilla and honey. The finish is medium length and tart with a lingering spiciness. We're starting to see more whiskies finished in mezcal casks now that they've been approved for use in Scotland, and it's a nice change of pace. I'm scoring the Dewar's Illegal Smooth blended Scotch whiskey a 90. Next up, the Elijah Craig Toasted Barrel Bourbon. As we mentioned a couple of weeks ago when this one was announced, Heaven Hill has taken the standard Elijah Craig small batch and given it some extra time in toasted and lightly charred barrels. The same bottling strength, 47% ABV. The nose has notes of toasted bread, honey, brown sugar, dark chocolate, and vanilla. The taste is well balanced with good spices, a soft oakiness, honey, vanilla, caramel candy, and dark chocolate. The finish is long and smooth, with lingering spices and dark chocolate. I'm scoring the Elijah Craig Toasted Barrel Bourbon a 92. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey, which will be releasing the next batch of Penny's Proof later this year. It's a preview of Sagamore Spirit Whiskey, distilled on site in Baltimore, and last year's first release of samples sold out in hours. The only way to find out when and how to get your hands on this year's batch is to join Sagamore Spirit's Whiskey Thieves. Sign up today at sagamorespirit.com. Barrel and Bottle gives us a chance to compare two American single malts from Kentucky's Town Branch Distillery. I'll start with an 11-year-old single cask that was matured in an ex-bourbon barrel, then finished in a freshly emptied Town Branch bourbon barrel, then bottled at 54.5% ABV. The double cask has a dark golden color. The nose is malty with a good oakiness and touches of butterscotch, honey, and anise. The taste, nice and spicy with black pepper, cinnamon, and a hint of clove, complemented nicely by butterscotch, oak tannins, honey, and anise. Adding some water opens up touches of red apples and apricots. The finish is long and spicy, with a nice oakiness and just a hint of molasses. I'm scoring the Barrel and Bottle Town Branch Double Cask a 92. The second one is also a single cask, but it spent 10 years and 4 months in an Oloroso sherry barrel. It's bottled at 60% ABV, and the nose has a nice oakiness with notes of figs, brown sugar, muted spices, molasses cookies, and just a hint of butterscotch. The taste is peppery and intense, with touches of figs and dates underneath, along with touches of licorice, anise, and molasses that come out as the spices fade. A few drops of water opens up touches of cherries and raisins, and the finish is long and aromatic with anise, molasses, and a nice touch of oak. I'm scoring the Barrel and Bottle Town Branch Oloroso Sherry Barrel Single Malt a 90. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, and I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,900 different whiskeys from all over the world. You can check it out this week at whiskycast.com. Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. Eddie D'Souza of Milroy's of Soho in London posted this comment on LinkedIn about our interview 2 weeks ago with David Jennings on his book, American Spirit, Wild Turkey Bourbon from Rippy to Russell. Great episode, listening to the story behind the Wild Turkey whiskey and all the influence of the Russells into its quality and history is just reassuring that no matter what we are going through right now, whiskey will make us stronger and better. We just need to believe in it and keep doing our best. Cheers, Mark. Thank you, Eddie. We talked about the recycling of old whiskey barrels into garden planters recently on Behind the Label. Mark Williams emailed this from Kentucky. I see whiskey barrels, mostly Jack Daniels, around Kentucky and Ohio at home improvement stores. The first photo I took last summer at a Lowe's in Lexington and figured that it had to be used for the Jack Daniels Sinatra edition. I had seen other grooved barrels before at another store. The other one is from today in my backyard. I bought it last year. I prefer it cut this way, as more can be grown in it. Mark included photos of both barrels. That second one was cut along the length of the barrel instead of through the middle. And he is right. It does give you more room for plants, but you do have to do a lot more work since it means cutting through the hoops and trying to keep the whole thing from falling apart. I'll post those photos on our social media accounts once Mark gives us the green light. Paul Finn emailed from England on this one as well. Hi, Mark. Love the show. I was interested in the part you mentioned about making things from old barrels. When we stayed in Scotland a few years back, our house had a great drinks cabinet made from an old barrel. I managed to find the company in Speyside who made it, and had one transported down to central England. I love it. The colored LED lights finish it off nicely. They are so much more useful than a planter. Keep up the good work, Paul. Thanks for sharing that, Paul. And following up on last week's podcast, and our look at the future of whiskey festivals, as the COVID-19 pandemic keeps causing problems worldwide, Dennis Hendricks at Black Sheep Red Sheep on Instagram posted this from the Netherlands. So sad. What will the future be like? As a freelance ambassador with all cancellations of festivals and tastings, it will put many of us on the line and rethink our future. He also included a crying emoji. No arguments there, Dennis. This is not a good time to be a freelancer in any business. And Paul O'Kayan pointed out on Facebook that we missed one successful virtual festival. Belfast Whiskey Week pulled off the world's largest Irish whiskey festival fully online. That they did, and congratulations to them. Finally, I received this email from Malcolm Geffen this weekend. In today's COVID-19 environment, how are whiskey clubs meeting to share their liquor selections? I'm assuming many clubs are meeting via Zoom or a similar protocol, but how are members tasting the same liquor? Are the members individually buying their own bottles and then talking about their tasting notes via Zoom? Or are club members sending small bottles of 50 ml or so to each other so they can taste the same liquid, with each member taking a different month to send out the liquor? And if they are sending it, are they using the U.S. Postal Service or some other service like FedEx or UPS? I'm involved in starting a whiskey club, and we're trying to figure out the model that would work for us. Any suggestions would be very appreciated. Well, I'm putting this out there in the hopes that we can get some answers from people in other whiskey clubs for Malcolm. But there are a couple of things to keep in mind on the legal front. I hate to throw water on these ideas, but it is illegal in the United States to send alcohol through the U.S. Postal Service, period. FedEx and UPS only allow alcohol shipments from those with liquor licenses in states that allow alcohol shipments in the first place. I am not saying that those shipments still don't happen, and of course the rules will vary from country to country. Just make sure you know first what the rules are in your area. If you have a comment, suggestion, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers all over the world, you can always get in touch with us on social media. We're at Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all those other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. This time around, I want to update our Behind the Label segment from episode 771 in June of last year, when we last looked at the issue of whether whiskeys should be considered gluten-free. There is some definitive guidance on that front now. This week, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued a new rule on the use of gluten-free in labeling claims. That rule clearly states that distillation is considered a process to remove gluten, and it's not likely that any leftover gluten may be present in a distilled food product, which means those products may now have a gluten-free claim on their labels. However, the Treasury Department's Tax and Trade Bureau has the final say when it comes to labels for distilled spirits, as well as other alcoholic beverages. The TTB currently only allows the use of gluten-free on labels for products that are made from ingredients that do not contain gluten, but does allow labels to state whether the spirit has been treated to remove gluten, with the requirement that the label describe exactly how that was done and a disclaimer that the gluten content cannot be verified. That has been the TTB's policy since 2014, but look for a change in it soon. That's because there's a long-standing agreement between the two agencies that while the TTB has primary responsibility for enforcing labeling regulations for alcohol under federal law, its regulations are expected to be consistent with the FDA's labeling regulations for food. Just how does distillation remove gluten in the first place? Well, when there's gluten present in the grains used to make whiskey, it gets as far as the still, but no farther. As alcohol vapors evaporate once the wash reaches the boiling point for alcohol, only the alcohol and some water vapor do evaporate. Gluten is among the solids left behind that often wind up as feed for livestock. By the way, it only took the FDA 6 years to resolve that question. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. We love to hear from you. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.